Right, good afternoon everybody. I think we're all ready to get started. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Gemma Catney, who's here at Geography and Planning. Today she's going to be talking about how to measure ethnic group diversity and segregation. A number of you may have seen the press releases Gemma's released over the past couple of weeks on these subjects. She's been working on the very latest census data. She's worked in a variety of contexts, Queen's and Belfast, also in the Cathy Marsh Centre for Survey Research, so we'll have an expert talking to us on various issues of demography and internal migration and so on. So thank you very much, Gemma.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, so I'm a Liverpool Trust Early Career Fellow, and my project is concerned with the geographies of ethnic and social segregation in England and Wales over the last 2 decades, so between 1991 and 2011. So when I was asked to do a how-to talk, what I wanted to focus on was how to measure ethnic group diversity and segregation. And the reason segregation is inverted commas in this is that it is an emotive topic. It's something that generates a lot of different impressions and opinions in people's minds, and that's something that will come up. There are also different ways to measure segregation, and that's the focus of the talk. So sometimes we need to think critically about these words, and so I've put it in inverted commas there, as will become clear. Now, there were 2 different ways that I could organise this talk, well, infinite number of ways I suppose, but 2 major ways, and one was to look at the diversity of different measures of segregation and maybe concentrate on 1 or 2 slides and go through the whole suite of different segregation indices and different ways that we could look at segregation, which is useful in a way, and you go away with a kind of sense of the different ways that we might measure segregation. But another way, if you Google it or get in touch with me or another person that deals with segregation, you can come away with the same information. So what I thought might be more useful actually was to concentrate. I will give you that information, so I will go over some of those segregation measures, but I think really to concentrate on 1 or 2 specific measures of segregation and look more specifically, a kind of case study led approach if you like. So I've done recent empirical work on the most recent release of the census data, and I think that talking through some of the challenges that I faced in measuring segregation using these data is actually probably more useful to you as a potential researcher in segregation. Okay, so what do we mean by segregation then? To some extent we could call it the degree of separateness of a given population. It's a way of understanding or measuring a population distribution. The most commonly cited paper in measures of segregation, and one that you will never avoid if you start to become interested in these measures, is by Macy and Denton in 1988. And they identified 5 dimensions of segregation. This probably seemed quite abstract to anyone who hasn't yet explored any of the segregation literature. But essentially, they said that the population could be measured and defined by its evenness, its exposure, concentration, centralisation or clustering. And with that there's a suite of segregation indices which measure these different dimensions. Now Reardon O'Sullivan in 2004 complicated matters a little bit and actually argued that those 5 dimensions could be collapsed into 2, and they termed that spatial exposure and spatial evenness, and that's something we'll come back to later. Now, types of segregation. There could be segregation in a workplace, segregation in schools, or residential segregation, which we're probably most familiar with. Population subgroups, so the people that could be segregated, if you like, could be males and females, socioeconomic status or class. One could be segregated by religion or by ethnic group, and it's ethnic group segregation and residential segregation that's the focus of this talk. So why study ethnic group segregation? Well, it is an area that is featured quite commonly in media and in popular discourse in Britain in recent years, and that's linked to the rise of several key issues that have been discussed quite frequently in media and political and popular discourse. For example, immigration, issues of population concentration and dispersal, identities, values and so-called Britishness. Terms that are used variably, like community cohesion, multiculturalism and integration, and also themes of inequalities, social cohesion and social exclusion. The reason those issues have been brought to the fore is through a variety of different contexts in the UK. A diversification of immigration streams, debates about the willingness to integrate, and you might be familiar with the so-called parallel lives debate. Linked to that, threats about national security and so-called traditional British values, within a context of an economic recession and joblessness. And if you remember the recent census results, particularly in December when the national level statistics were released, a lot of discussion was had about levels of white Britishness in the UK, in England and Wales, and the level of a foreign-born population. In policy and politics as well, it's an issue. Integration has become a policy issue, and there is debate about how diversity is affecting our society. So because of that, it's important that we monitor segregation and actually try and understand how society is changing. So we might use this term critically, but actually in order to get at the meaning behind this, we do probably need to measure it. And there's also relevance to issues like discrimination and the persistence of unequal opportunities, like housing and in the labour market. Now, if you're going to get interested in segregation and studying segregation, there's some useful introductory literature that I would recommend. For example, Kerry Peach in 1996 published an article in Planning Perspectives where he talked about so-called good and bad segregation. Good segregation meaning the different ways that segregation can actually be a positive thing. So the reason that a population might cluster for a positive reason. For example, an immigrant settlement area. It's an obvious natural process. If someone moves from a different country, there are going to be clusters that are more attractive to those immigrants. So there might be a well-established network of other immigrants. There might be particular services, and those services are present in that area, and good networks and communication. Bad segregation might be linked to those issues I just mentioned about discrimination and the persistence of unequal opportunities, and that's when segregation can become problematic, is if those clusters lead to an unequal opportunity. Kerry also discussed slippery segregation, which is much more about the meaning of the measurement of segregation, and if you get into these indices, then that paper would be worth looking up. Linked to that, then, Ludie Simpson in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society talked about ghettos of the mind and the actual construction of measures and how they can be interpreted in different ways, and they need to be used carefully. A more kind of critical perspective is provided by Debbie Phillips in Geography Compass, who argues that actually maybe measuring segregation is perpetuating the arguments that maybe some of us are trying to dispel, and that is that by using terms like segregation, which are so emotive and loaded, are we actually contributing to that debate in a positive way? So what do we know so far in real brief? We know that Britain does not have so-called ghettos, and Peach in Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers and in that Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies paper I mentioned proves that. We know that segregation decreased between 1991 and 2001, and that's in several papers that are outlined there. What about since 2001? Well, I'm going to be talking about that in due course. We also know that segregation by income, wealth and employment is greater than segregation by ethnicity. So how do we measure ethnicity? If we want to look at something like segregation by ethnic group, then we need to think about how we actually get those data and how we think about how to measure ethnic group. I just co-edited a book with a colleague in Manchester, Nisa Finney, on minority internal migration in Europe. But what we did at the end of, there was a series of chapters looking at minority internal movement within Europe, and at the end we collated all of those chapters and said, okay, how did the authors conceptualise ethnicity and actually use data on ethnicity? Where did those data come from? And as you can see, there's a diversity of measuring that diversity. So, for example, in some countries, birthplace is used, nationality or citizenship. In Britain, we use country of origin. Moved from another country can define an immigrant to some extent, but obviously that status can change over time. And a self-identified ethnic or religious group, which is what we're going to focus on today. So how do we measure ethnicity back home then in Britain? Well, the population census has been the most commonly used data source. Why is that? It provides superior coverage of both population and space. There is no other survey that covers the population in the way that the census does. It's legal requirement to fill out your census form, so in theory everybody in England and Wales and in Scotland and in Northern Ireland should have filled out their census form. It also provides superior coverage of space. Okay, so there are sample surveys that maybe get to smaller geographical areas than the census can, and that's because of disclosure issues, for example. But in terms of coverage of the whole of the population, the census can't be beaten. And alternative sources just don't cut it. I've put a note there, Save Our Census, because there's a big debate at the minute about the 2011 census being the last one in the UK, and it's really important actually that it's not, and academics are currently debating quite a lot and trying to make a case for the fact that we should save our census. Some of the downfalls, the time between censuses, if you do start to use these data, like I did in the midpoint between 2001 and 2011, then you're kind of left waiting quite a long time for the next update, and from about 2008 onwards papers continually ended with these data are getting old. We're ready for the next census. So that's why it's been so exciting over the last couple of months that these data have now been released. Levels of geography as well. Now I said that was an advantage of the census, but it can be a disadvantage too. The smallest geographical area at which data are released in the census is the output area, and the average population of that is about 300 people. So these are small areas, but if you really want to get to the nitty-gritty of a neighbourhood, a really small geographical area, then maybe sometimes 300 people is actually a little too large. And the number of cross-tabulations as well. So when you want to think about ethnicity, you might start to be interested in how ethnicity and economic status interact, and how age and sex interacts with that too. Now the further you go down that line of different variables being cross-tabulated with each other, the less likely you are to get those data. The Office for National Statistics are obviously very concerned with data disclosure, and they rightly don't release anything that could be potentially identifiable. So sometimes that can be a little frustrating if you want a little more detail. Okay, so we've had an ethnic group question since 1991. Before that, people interested in these questions used country of birth data. There has been a change in question between the censuses, which leads to an issue of comparability over time. Okay, so in 1991, this is an extract from the census household form, and that's the ethnic group question, and the respondent is asked to tick the appropriate box. Okay, so as you can see, there are very few categories there, just several tick boxes, 2 options to write in, black other or other ethnic group. By 2001, these had been extended. The question changed actually as well slightly. So, okay, what is your ethnic group? But if you can read underneath that, I'm not sure if that's easy to see, an individual is asked to indicate their cultural background. The white category was further disaggregated into British, Irish, and a write-in option for any other white background. A mixed category, importantly, was introduced to reflect the mixed population of England and Wales, and the growing mixed population of England and Wales. Some other additions were that these other categories were expanded, so between different categories of Asian, Black, Chinese, one could write in another option. In 2011, the census form, thankfully for those interested in change over time, changed a lot less than it did from 1991. The question again changed slightly, and rather than cultural background, it's how can you best describe your ethnic group or background? So there's a slight change in wording there. There need to be tests on how much that matters, possibly not very much, but we'll see. The white group saw a new category as well, Gypsy or Irish Traveller, and an Arab group was introduced as well. The Chinese group was also moved up into the Asian category, so there's some issues there that might be of interest in terms of comparability. Okay, so if we're going to look at change over time, then if you really want to go back to 1991, you do end up throwing away some data, and the recommended group are these categories. What you can see is you get a residual other category where basically everything else is thrown in, and that means that the other group really isn't that comparable over time. There has been some work done on the longitudinal study of the Office for National Statistics, which shows, so these follow the same individuals over time, again fully data disclosure control there, so you can't identify that person, but you can see if they tick the same box or the equivalent box between 1991 and 2001. And there has been quite a lot of migration between ethnic groups, particularly in these other categories, which means that the other group actually isn't that comparable over time. So it's there just for completeness, but actually in terms of change over time, that's an area that, or a group that we should be wary of. And then those additional groups from the 2011 census would go into white and Arab into other. Okay, so just as a little bit of background then, here's our new England and Wales population according to the 2011 census, some 56 million. The white population still by far the majority in England and Wales. There has been some decline in the white population, but a growth in the white other population. In fact, that was the fastest growing over that time point. So that's within that white category, so you can't see those individual groups within that. In terms of these minority groups then, you can see that between 2001 and 2011, the African group was the fastest growing there. But the minority groups still remain fairly small in England and Wales terms. The mixed or multiple ethnic group category falls into this residual other category, so I just took that out to have a look. Obviously you can't go back to 1991 because that option wasn't in the 1991 census form. And the mixed or multiple ethnic group is rising quite considerably in England and Wales, and it's now over 1 million, and that rose from 1.3% to 2.2% in 2001. And 2011, and I'll come back to that in more detail. Okay, so what do we need to look at segregation? We need ethnic group counts, that's done, we've been talking about that. We also need geography, okay, so we need spatial information about those ethnic group counts. Now there are several administrative census geographies from which we can choose. If you want to compare changes over time, then you need to think about boundary change issues, because if you're looking at an area and say the ethnic group population in that area, and then you look at that same area in 2011, if the boundary has changed at all, then you're not comparing like with like, and that is a big issue. If you're interested in that, there are sorts of ways that can deal with that, and you can talk to me afterwards, but I'm not going to deal with that so much now. Suffice to say that between 2001 and 2011, output areas didn't change very much between the two time points. It's something like 2.6% of output areas were boundaries changed, so that's really, really very small actually. So they are fairly comparable over time actually. Okay, we call this a high-level geography, a low-level geography, the highest meaning the largest area. Okay, now there are 348 local authority districts in 2011. They have a mean population of 161,000. Arguably I should be using median here actually, but I think that mean is probably a little more familiar in people's minds, so I've gone with mean. Electoral wards, there are 8,587. The reason that's in red is there are 17 electoral wards at which the Office for National Statistics didn't release census data because they were deemed too small. So really 8,570. Output areas then are the smallest area, and I've mentioned those already, with a mean population of 300 people or so and about 120 households. Okay, so the Index of Dissimilarity is by far the most commonly used measure of segregation. It measures the population unevenness in an area, okay, so how evenly the population is distributed across an area. What you can do is compare between ethnic groups, so for example the Chinese group compared to the white British group. But usually more sensibly what's done is comparing an ethnic group like, for example, the Chinese to the rest of the population. So how evenly distributed is that ethnic group compared to the rest of the population? If you're not that sort of familiar with formula and so on, I don't want to push too much onto this, but basically what the measure does is takes the population of a given ethnic group, let's say white British in an area, divided by the total white British population. Taken away from that is the population of the rest of the population of the rest of the ethnic groups, the rest of the population in that area, over the full total rest of the population, summed and times by the number of areas, times that by 50, and you get a percentage. What does that mean? It means that what the number that you get from this measure is how much of the given ethnic group, so in this case white British we talked about, would have to move areas to be distributed evenly across the population. Okay, so let's disaggregate that a little bit more. How much, so what proportion, like percentage, of the given group, for example white British, would have to move areas, for example to another district, to be distributed evenly, so to have the same geographic proportions in the district as the whole population. Okay, so in this example then, this population of the white British in an area could be a district over the total population in all of the areas, England and Wales for example, so district within England and Wales. So what you would get for that would be 1 D value for the white British population for all of England and Wales. So you could look at smaller geographical areas, like for example output areas within districts, so you'll get a value for the district in that case. 0% indicates a completely even spread of the population, and 100% means complete segregation. To some of you this will be really simple and familiar actually if you've been dealing with segregation measures. To others this might seem very abstract, so I'm aware that I'm trying to deal with a sort of diverse audience. If you want to rank them, the second most commonly used measure of segregation is the Index of Isolation. That measures the exposure of a population to other groups. Okay, so the degree to which a member of a group, like the white British, are exposed to only members of that ethnic group. So values close to 100 would indicate a high probability that members of that group encounter other members of the same group, and a low probability of encountering members of a different ethnic group. So it talks about your interaction and your exposure to other ethnic groups. It measures something quite different really, in a way, from population unevenness. How do we get that then? We take the population of the white British in an area, districts in England and Wales, over the total population in England and Wales, times that by the total population of that group in an area, again, so white British, over the total population in that area. Okay, so in, for example, the district within England and Wales. Now there's some problems with that measure. If the whole population grows, then the measure can increase as well. So a comparison of that index across time or between populations is actually quite risky. You can get around that by standardising by the total population, but it's just to make you aware of one of the big limitations of that measure. So As I mentioned, the most commonly used measure is the Index of Dissimilarity, and so that's really what I'm going to focus on today, because I think if you wanted to start getting interested in something like segregation, that would be a really good starting point. And conceptually, I think it's a bit easier to understand as well. So, on the 31st of January, output area data were released over England and Wales by various variables, for example, ethnic group, religion, things like employment, age and class, those sorts of things. That means that we can look at what we might call neighbourhood segregation. Okay, so output areas, which are these small geographical areas. I did a lot of work over the last month to update what I've been doing from 1991 to 2001. I've been dealing with what we call local measures of segregation, which I'll touch on briefly at the end. But these global measures of segregation, really what we've been talking about there, is the focus of this case study, because I think that's possibly the best starting point to introduce these ideas. So the question, has neighbourhood ethnic segregation decreased? I haven't magically published something in a month. That would be unbelievable. Reviewer turnaround would be fantastic. This is a briefing that you can find on www.ethnicity.ac.uk, and there are now 5 census briefings which look at how the population of England and Wales has changed over the last 10 years. They started in December because the national level statistics and the district level statistics were released then, and so we could look at those broad geographical areas and think about national level changes in populations, a bit like the table I showed you earlier. They are mainly authored by Ludi Simpson and Stephen Givraj at Manchester, where this centre is based. They've asked me to contribute my work on neighbourhood segregation, and this is what the briefing looks like. It's fairly accessible language, so if you want to download that, that's actually possibly quite useful just to look at, to bring you up to date with what's been going on. But I'm going to use that as a basis then to talk about, well, what's been happening first of all, so you get a little bit of new empirical findings. I know this isn't a research seminar, so I won't spend too long on that, but I think that's possibly of interest to some people, talking to people that I knew were coming along, so I think that's maybe worth spending some time. But then actually looking at the problems that I faced in measuring these things and the issues that you might want to think about in your own work. Okay, so you've seen the briefing. I did a press release last week based on this information, this update, showing how neighbourhood segregation has decreased between 2001 and 2011. As I mentioned, segregation decreased between 1991 and 2001. That has accelerated over the last 10 years, and that decrease has picked up, and it's decreasing even more at a faster rate, if you like, than the 10 years before that. I was really lucky that The Guardian were really interested in it, so they ran an article on that, and since then I've done 4 live BBC radio interviews, which you can probably tell by the bags under my eyes. Breakfast shows and me do not go together. But it's been really fantastic to see how that's been picked up, and people are really taking on board that story of decreasing segregation and how we think about these issues. Okay, what does it mean? These are output areas summed across local authority districts, so what I talked about in terms of the Index of Dissimilarity earlier. What I did was I took only districts that had more than 200 people of a given ethnic group in both 2001 and in 2011. The reason being, areas with very small populations of a given group are very sensitive to change. Okay, so if you have in an area a Bangladeshi population of 20 people, and then that doubles over the period to 40 people, that's really very small amount of people. But segregation, the measure of segregation used here, the Index of Dissimilarity, will increase quite markedly. It could increase quite markedly in that time point, but it's not really a fair representation of what's going on the ground. So 200 isn't completely arbitrary. I took the median population for every ethnic group at both time points, 2001 and 2011. Unsurprisingly, the lowest median population is in 2001 because ethnic groups have grown. That's for the Bangladeshi population has the smallest median, and it's around 207 or 209. So I said anything then below 200 isn't included. There are other ways that you can think about these population thresholds, and actually Paul Williamson, who's sitting at the back, published a really good article on thinking about these ideas, and that's Williamson and Vos. If you're interested in that, I can give you the reference afterwards. Okay, so what we have on the y-axis is the percentage of districts. Now remember, because I've got this threshold, that means there is a different number of districts for each ethnic group. Okay, they're comparable, But that means that for some groups that are a bit smaller, like the Bangladeshi population, there are less districts than the white British population, where for every single area there is at least 200 people in both time points. So they're standardised to be a percentage, okay, so they're comparable. Along the x-axis is the percentage point change in segregation between 2001 and 2011. And these are these are classes of change in segregation. They're labelled with a single number because it actually just looked a little easier to understand in the briefing. But these thresholds, if it says 5, that means 0 to 10, for example, 15, 10 to 20. Orange indicates an increase in segregation, purple a decrease. Okay, so these are the proportion of districts that have either increased or decreased their segregation over the period. And what the overwhelming message, as you've probably already figured out, is that for all ethnic minority groups, the story is of decreasing segregation in the period. And for some groups, over 2/3 of districts decreased their segregation. So these are output areas in districts, okay, so neighbourhoods really. The Indian group, for example, the mixed group, the African group and the Caribbean group all saw a decrease in over 2/3 of districts in segregation, in some cases really quite markedly. You'll also notice this, the white British increase in segregation. I have to say that this needs to be really interpreted with care, and I will come back to this and the meaning of this. But first of all, just most of the districts that did see an increase are in this smaller category of 0 to 10%. That's a big category, okay. Most districts are 5% or below increase, and actually quite a lot have an increase of only 2 or 3%. So we're talking very, very small changes here. The white British is, as you've seen, by far the majority ethnic group in England and Wales. So it's actually very unsegregated because it's very evenly spread. If you get an increase in diversity in an area, say for example a rural area which is traditionally completely white British, all that can happen to that segregation index, if that diversity increases, is that the index goes up for the white British, for the majority group. Okay. On the ground, that really means there's increased mixing and sharing of communities and ethnic groups, because that white British area, if you want to call it that, has now suddenly increased its diversity, but the segregation measure says it's gone up. So we need to be careful about large populations as well as small populations. Okay. London isn't pregnant. This is a cartogram which distorts space according to population density, okay? So it basically just means that we can have a look properly really at these most dense population areas. A story very much of decreasing segregation in urban areas for example for these ethnic groups, and actually the story is the case for all ethnic minority groups. Okay, so why? What might be going on? Oh, finally before that. If we classify areas, so districts, according to some mechanism by which we might want to think that areas could be grouped together, not across space, so not areas that are beside each other, but actually types of areas. So an area classification is quite useful for that. This is based on OPCS area typologies, which cannot be updated yet for the 2011 census because we don't have all of those data available yet. We need cross-tabulations for that, and they won't be out until the summer. If you're interested in this, you can look at Tony Champion's article, or again ethnicity.ac.uk. Basically, again, the story that's been shown in those maps, a story very much of decreasing percentage point change in segregation over the last 10 years, and really particularly in these urban areas. So this is just looking at urban areas here. Some of that's really marked change. So, for example, my perspective's all wrong here, it's really Inner London, we can see the mixed category and the Chinese category the Chinese category. No, Inner London. The mixed category, yes. And the Chinese category. Trust myself. For Outer London, we can see marked decreases for the Bangladeshi group, for the Chinese group. Other large cities have seen a big decrease in segregation by the African ethnic group by some 20% actually. A small increase by the white British population in all of those urban typologies, but really no more than 3%. What might be going on then? Excuse me 1 second. Now, we don't have internal migration data on the census yet. They won't be released until the summer or possibly even the autumn. So the processes behind this change in segregation we need to think about conceptually and maybe look back to what we know from previous work. This is a district, a hypothetical district, and within that there'll be lots of output areas, okay? These are people. Take this as maybe an area, a district that has an urban cluster of a given ethnic group. Maybe an immigrant settlement area, an area that has experienced higher immigration than around the rest of the area. Maybe that's a traditional, historic type flow of movement, which again, as I mentioned earlier, reflects good networks, good services, that sort of thing. Over time, some of that immigrant community might leave the UK and go elsewhere, go back to their country of origin. Some that do stay, and we also get second and third generation British-born minorities, might move around that district, disperse within the urban area. That will decrease segregation. And why might that happen? Well, familiarity with an area, the fact that maybe sometimes these services don't become so important over time, or someone knows of a nice area nearby. They relied on a network beforehand in which to find a house, and now over time there's increased familiarity with an area. The next scenario, which would decrease segregation, would be to move to maybe a suburban area, and that will decrease segregation within that urban area. And that is a process that's been happening in Britain for decades. Movement from the inner city to the suburbs, and it's a stage of a life course that we're probably all familiar with. Okay, so you maybe have a family and you want a quieter lifestyle. The urban centre living isn't so attractive anymore, and you want to have a bigger house or a garden or whatever. And that is happening for all ethnic groups, white British and all ethnic minority groups. Now, again, as I said, we don't have migration data available yet, but previous work that I've done and that colleagues in Manchester have done has shown that when you control for all sorts of other characteristics, this process is taking place for all ethnic minority groups if the resources are available. Okay, so if enough capital is accumulated, then that might happen. After that, or even possibly at the same time, you might get movement from the suburbs to more rural areas. Now, it's likely that initially that will be to rural small towns rather than maybe a very, very rural area, if you want to classify it that way. That would maybe likely to be just sort of a small town, for example. So there might be an initial cluster in those areas. Over time, that urban area will be refilled by immigrants again. Now, those immigrants could move back to the cluster, or it could be the same ethnic group. It could be members of a different ethnic group. So they could move to this cluster or actually move across the urban area, just to different areas, and segregation therefore will still go down in that period. Some notes on that then. For that to happen, there has to be equal opportunities and minimise discrimination. If those housing aspirations are to be the same for every ethnic group. Secondly, it shouldn't be assumed that that's an inevitable model over time, that suburbanisation and counter-urbanisation, as we put it, takes place. That's closely allied to what we call assimilation theory, which is heavily critiqued in the literature, and in some cases rightly so. So it shouldn't be assumed that that model is the preferred model, but we do know that it is taking place for a lot of ethnic groups. Okay. So complexities in that measurement so far. These are the kind of wee nitty-gritty things that you might want to think about. Small groups. The mixed groups, are a vastly growing group in England and Wales. Okay. And I'll come back to the reasons for that in due course. So I grouped all the mixed ethnic groups. There are 4 mixed ethnic groups: mixed other, mixed Asian, mixed white and Caribbean, and mixed white and African. There's no such thing really as a mixed community in England and Wales, so you could probably argue that actually in some ways one needs to be careful about what that means. But if you want to think about what's happening to the mixed community over time, then that is still a useful and valid clumping, if you like, of those groups. Changed meanings of ethnic groups over time. The other group, as we're familiar with, isn't so comparable over time, so that's not been in the study. I had to think about population thresholds, which I've actually spent more time on earlier than I intended to. I was saving that for later, so we've dealt with that, I think we're clear on that. In the 2001 census, there was a reasonable amount of undercount, and that disproportionately affected ethnic minority groups and populations in urban areas. So some work by Albert Sabater and by Louis Simpson, that's now published in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, was to deal with that undercount and to produce estimates, census estimates. That was Albert's PhD a few years ago. So these data are arguably more sensible to use, so that's what I used as my base for 2001. Scale issues. I want you to think about levels of segregation in very small areas. Think of a street with maybe 10 houses. Imagine that street has members of the same ethnic group in that street, but in the next street there are members of different ethnic groups. In the next street, there might be members of the same ethnic group, but a different one to that street that I asked you to think about. If you draw a boundary around that single street, what will segregation be? It'll be 100%. But actually, what neighbourhood is just one street? And we're talking 10 houses. Your neighbourhood is sort of an area around that. Now, there are all sorts of literature about what a neighbourhood is, but that's an interesting thing to think about. Scale is really significant in segregation studies, and it's something that I'm dealing with quite a lot in this fellowship, is to think about the effect of scale on these measurements and how that can change the story over time. So, given that, if you imagine the hierarchy of geography census outputs, a district, which is the largest census output area, I'll not use the word output area, census area at which data are disclosed. Segregation for a district will be much lower than segregation in a ward, and actually segregation in an output area will be higher than that again. The reason being those are smaller areas, it's effective scale. Okay. Rural areas have increased their diversity and their mixing over time. We don't have migration data, but we do know that rural areas have seen an increase in diversity. So what happens to segregation with that? If we go back to this hypothetical scenario then, what you get is if there is movement of one group or several groups to rural areas, what's likely to happen is a kind of cascade of movement, if you like, so movement from an urban area to a suburban area, eventually to a rural area. But that rural area, that initial rural move, is most likely, as I said earlier, to a town or somewhere like that. So there might be initial clustering in those rural areas, which drives up segregation. And you might see that as a temporary increase in rural segregation, that then over time, as that population disperses, segregation will go down. So that's one of the explanations for why urban areas have seen much more of a decrease in segregation, and that some rural areas have seen an increase over time of ethnic minority groups. One critique of this is all of this just due to white British population loss from cities? You'll have seen in the media some discussion about white British population loss from London. So if you imagine that an area like London has a mixed population of white British and other ethnic minority groups, if that white British population leave an area, London, or just imagine a hypothetical area if that helps, if that's easier, that means that population that's left behind, so to speak, will be less segregated, more residentially integrated. Now, I've looked at the correlation between white British population loss and decreasing segregation for all ethnic groups, and that's really weakly correlated. There are many areas that have seen an increase in white British population and a decrease in ethnic minority segregation. So this is not a function of white British population loss. Finally, the white British increased their segregation, and why? And I have dealt with that a little bit, but just to remind you, there's the graph. Right, here's a district, these are all output areas. This is the white British population, segregation is 0. White British population is completely evenly spread in this area, like a rural area, for example. And that is the case in many areas in England and Wales, where the white British population is by far the majority. Increase the diversity of that area a little bit, and what happens to white British segregation? It goes up. But actually there's more sharing of those areas, they're more mixed, but segregation has gone up. Okay, I'm not sure how many people will be interested in measuring diversity in itself rather than segregation, but it is an interesting aspect of segregation that's also linked in some way, so I thought it might be worth just briefly mentioning that. Time is escaping. Diversity is complex, and in this case, this reciprocal diversity index that I'm going to deal with, it just simply measures ethnic group diversity. You might want to think about other ways of measuring diversity. For example, we have a question on identity, and we found, for example, the national level data showed that some 91% of the population had a British identity. Only 9% of the population had an identity other than British. Okay. To take this measure, you square each ethnic group proportion in an area, sum the values, divide the sum into 1, and then standardise that to give a value between 0 and 100. What it means is that where the RDI, the reciprocal diversity index, is 100, every group is in equal proportion in the area. Now the average for England and Wales is 3, just 3. And there are a few local areas, so this is at electoral ward level, there are a few electoral wards in England and Wales that are so diverse they have an almost equal proportion in each ethnic group. 9 of the 10 most diverse wards in England and Wales are, unsurprisingly, located in London. They're in Newham and Brent, and the other one in Croydon. The most diverse ward outside London is in Birmingham. This is the ethnic group breakdown for that most diverse electoral ward in England and Wales, Dollis Hill in Brent, that has an RDI of 56. As you can see, there is no ethnic group which has a majority of more than 14% in that area. The white British population and the other white population are the majority in that area. Now, what's happening to the most diverse local areas in terms of segregation? They are located in areas that have seen, in districts that have seen a decrease in segregation over the period. And segregation levels for Brent and Newham are actually amongst the lowest in the country, in England and Wales. Diverse areas are not dominated by one ethnic group, and they shouldn't be seen as segregated, and they're not becoming more so. Okay, I'm not sure if anyone is here from health, but I was told that could be a possibility. So I think one common question is, how could segregation measures like D be used in my own research? Well, these global measures, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute, could be used correlated with other ecological variables. So, for example, a proportion in an area with a given health outcome, like good health, or deprivation measures. There are some examples from epidemiology and public health, like how does segregation relate to health outcomes, and if you're interested in that, you can have a look at some of these studies. I would say that the public health literature is actually not so hot on explaining why segregation might be related to health outcomes. One explanation is discrimination and unequal opportunities, for example, or the feeling of being marginalised in a particular area is one explanation, but I think that literature really probably needs some development. Okay, so the D values we've been exploring are what we call global measures. That is, they're a summary of a set of areas within a larger area. In this case, all output areas summed across local authority districts in England and Wales. And commonly they would be reported for a measure for an area like this, like England and Wales, or Manchester, Birmingham, wherever. Those measures are actually aspatial. They might sound spatial because these are place names, but they're actually aspatial. They don't account for the spatial variation in that area. So what do I mean by that? If you remember this hypothetical district that I showed and the urban cluster, when you sum across all those output areas in that district and you get that value, okay, you know what segregation is for output areas within that district. What you throw away is the fact that there is spatial variation within that most of that clustering takes place in the urban cluster, for example, in the urban area. So that isn't accounted for in global measures. Also, there's a whole suite, as I said, of different segregation measures that are correlated differently for different ethnic groups. A group might be really unevenly spread, but actually very exposed to members of another ethnic group. And that's something that actually hasn't been explored to date in the British literature, or at least very well. This is an example of why the global measures are a problem. It's called the Checkerboard Problem. Each of these scenarios, D, is exactly the same. Imagine this is England and Wales. This is a district in England and Wales. These are output areas within that district. And this is white and black are just two different ethnic groups, okay? What you can see is that in this case, each output area has a completely 100% of one ethnic group. That's the same here, in this area, and in this scenario too. Here's maybe an urban cluster. But, see, there's considerable spatial variation in that. But what D doesn't do is captures that at all. D will be 1 or 100 for all of these areas. So we've thrown that information away and we don't actually understand what's going on in terms of those areas. We've dealt with that. So what do local or spatial measures of segregation do? They account for those spatial variations. I did toy with the idea of getting into this in a little more depth, but I'm not sure if this is an appropriate forum. If you're interested in this, do get in touch, because this is really something that I'm quite excited about and that really isn't being done very much globally, let alone in England and Wales. So you would use a population weighting scheme, for example, nearest neighbours. Okay, so maybe take an output area and 50 nearest neighbours, the 50 closest output areas to that output area, and that's a weighting scheme which would take account of the population distribution in those areas. Or you might take a distance decay, so closer areas are given more weight than further away areas. Sum all of those and you get a spatial measure. If you take those individual parts, that's a local measure. So because you don't have one number reflecting a whole accumulation of an area, so a sum of zones, like one measure for all of Manchester, you get a measure for each smaller area within Manchester. That means you can correlate those measures of segregation with other variables, and that's when things become more interesting. So for example, your health outcomes there can actually be properly looked at in terms of how they relate. Okay, alternative segregation measures. How am I for time? I know it's 10:02, but what's the norm?
We'll just keep going.
Just keep going. Do just tell me. Mixing is one alternative measure of looking at segregation. This is really very simple, but it is used. So for example, the proportion of white residents and other groups exceeding some sort of arbitrary value, for example 10% or 25% of an area. You could look at population concentrations using arbitrary classes of each group in a population area. Okay, so an area is concentrated if it contains 80% or more of that ethnic group, for example. I'm not sure I'm going to spend much time on this, but it's just to say that really what we've been looking at is neighbourhood segregation, which sounds very small, but actually really interestingly, if you think about that, you can go even further and think about integration, and that's at the household level. And what the 2011 census showed was that mixing within the household, that most intimate way that a population can mix, that's in terms of families and partnerships, that kind of mixing has increased considerably over the last 10 years. So if you look at all households that contain more than one person, 12% of households are now with residents with multiple ethnic groups. 6.5% of households live with a spouse or partner with a different ethnic group to their own. I did show some statistics about the percentage of people of a mixed or multiple ethnic group, and that reflects that kind of mixing. So these are, for example, children of a partnership where the two members of that partnership have a different ethnic group. So that's just maybe worth highlighting. Another alternative way of thinking about how the population is distributed are location quotients, which are actually surprisingly used quite little in segregation studies. It talks about the representation of a group in an area, and I didn't put the formula in because I knew I'd get to the stage where I'd run out of time. But if a percentage of an ethnic group in a local area, for example an output area, matches its percentage for the total area, like a district, then the location quotient will be 1. If it's greater, the location quotient is greater than 1, and less than 1. And you can standardise that using something like you could use something like the standard deviation to think about over and under representation. So an example across the pond, Franklin County in Ohio, this shows under and over representation of several ethnic groups in this area. So what you can see is that the darker grey represents over-representation and the lighter under-representation. So that tells you about, in some degrees, the spatial variation in that area. It's not particularly sophisticated nor hard to do, but it's actually quite powerful, I think, in thinking about different clusters, and much more powerful than thinking just about percentages, for example. Okay, so we've dealt with mixing, we've dealt with location quotients. Miranda autocorrelation coefficient is really, really useful. It's a spatial measure, and it's a way of thinking about clustering, okay? What it does is thinks about how similar the proportion of the population is to the proportion of that group in its neighbouring locations, okay? And the neighbouring values, as I mentioned earlier, could be defined by nearest neighbours or by distance decay. And there are local versions of that as well that are really quite interesting. Again, that's maybe worth following up if you're interested in these ideas. Concentration profiles are a way of kind of visualising, I suppose, the distribution of a population. What it shows is the percentage of a group that lives in areas above a particular threshold of that group. They talk about processes and the different hypothetical scenarios for why we might be experiencing this decrease in segregation, and that's really important, and it shouldn't be omitted, and it is a lot in segregation studies. Migration is important because it's one of the ways in which segregation can change, a big key way. The extent of movement towards localities with the highest proportion of an ethnic group might be one way you could think about how a population might become more or less segregated. Ludi Simpson looked at this in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society and showed that that is not taking place for ethnic minority groups in 2001. So ethnic groups are not moving towards concentrations of their own ethnic group, and we need to update that for 2011, of course. I think I've tortured you enough on these different measures. Thank you.